Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're getting into something really fascinating, global power dynamics. But forget the old maps, the old ways of thinking about it.
Things are changing fast, right?
Exactly. And to help us understand just how much, we're looking at this report from the Munich Security Conference.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Huge. So let's jump right in. This report uses the term multipolarization. And it's not just a fancy word, is it?
No, not at all. It gets at this fundamental shift that's happening. The old idea of one superpower, or even two, calling the shots, that's fading. Power is becoming more spread out, more diffuse.
More players on the field, so to speak.
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask, more players sounds good, but more voices, more perspectives.
In theory, maybe. But think about it like this. Imagine the world was a chessboard before. Maybe two grandmasters making all the big moves.
Okay, I'm following.
Now it's like we've suddenly added several more grandmasters to the game, each with their own strategies, their own goals.
And they're not all going to play nice, are they?
Right. More players also means more potential for friction, for competition, even conflict. It's a more unpredictable game now.
So it's not just about who's the strongest anymore. It's about how all these different powers interact, how they try to outmaneuver each other.
Exactly. And this report suggests that this whole shift toward multipolarity is happening alongside another huge change.
Oh, let me guess. The decline of liberalism.
You got it. That free markets, democracy, individual rights, it's been dominant for decades, especially in the West.
And it's kind of been the model that everyone else was expected to follow, right?
Pretty much. But now it's being challenged, both from within.
Like with the rise of populism we've been seeing.
Exactly. And from the outside, too, with the success of alternative models. Think China, their state-driven capitalism, their more authoritarian approach.
And that's working for them in a lot of ways.
It is, which makes people question, well, is the Western way the only way?
So you've got these internal pressures, these external pressures, and they kind of feed off each other, don't they?
Absolutely. You see populist leaders in the West questioning global institutions. At the same time, you have countries like China saying, hey, our system works too, maybe even better.
It's a battle of ideas, a battle for influence, but on a global scale.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And the report really digs into how specific events like, for example, Trump's election and his whole America First thing.
It really shook things up, didn't it?
Hugely. It signaled the end of this long-standing consensus, both in the U.S. and globally, about America's role as the leader, the one calling the shots.
So what did the rest of the world think when the U.S. basically said, we're going to be more selective about who we help, what we get involved in?
Well, the report suggests it created a lot of uncertainty. America First means the U.S. is prioritizing things like containing China, maybe at the expense of things like unwavering support for NATO or for Ukraine.
And that leaves other countries wondering, okay, so if the U.S. steps back, who fills that void?
Right. Will it be someone with the same goals, the same values?
Or will it be somebody else?
Exactly. And the report spends a lot of time looking at how key players, specifically China and Russia, see this whole multipolar future playing out and what they're doing to shape it to their advantage.
Okay, so let's get into that. Let's start with China. They seem pretty happy about this multipolar world.
They are, and for good reason. For them, a world where power is more spread out means less U.S. influence, which, they see the U.S. as a rival.
Competition, for sure.
Big time. So China's been very strategic, building relationships across Asia, Africa, Latin America. Think massive infrastructure projects like their Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. Pouring money into ports, railways, all sorts of things.
Exactly. But it's not just about economics, right? China's political system, their whole vision for how the world should work. It's quite different from the Western model.
Right. Different values, different goals.
And that difference is key to how they approach this multipolar world. Unlike the U.S., China doesn't do formal military alliances like NATO. Instead, they focus on these economic and political partnerships, advancing their interests, but without getting tied down in the same way.
So they're playing a different game, but they're playing it well.
Very well. And then you have Russia. They've got their own unique take on multipolarity. The report highlights this too.
Okay, what's their angle?
It's interesting. They talk about a world divided into what they call civilization states.
Civilization states?
Yeah, think of it like big cultural blocks, each with their own sphere of influence. So imagine the West with its emphasis on individual liberty, that's one block. Countries with a Confucian heritage, that's another.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this could get messy.
Right, because what about smaller countries? What about their right to choose their own path?
Exactly. And what happens when these civilization states bump up against each other?
Well, the report uses Ukraine as an example. Russia sees Ukraine as part of their sphere of influence, culturally and historically.
But Ukraine wants closer ties with the West.
Exactly. And that's a recipe for conflict, which is what we're seeing.
So this shift to a multipolar world, it's not just theoretical. It's having real and potentially dangerous consequences.
No doubt about it. Competition is intensifying. The old rules are being rewritten. And the big question is, how do we navigate this new world? Can we manage this multipolarity without things spiraling out of control?
That's a question we'll be digging into in the next part of our deep dive. So we've been talking about this shift towards a multipolar world, right? More players, more competition, more potential for things to go wrong.
Definitely more complex.
For sure. But how is this actually playing out in different parts of the world? Like, where are the real hotspots?
Well, the report dives into a few specific regions, and one that really jumps out is the Indo-Pacific.
Oh, yeah, that's a powder keg.
Yeah.
You've got China flexing its muscles, the U.S. trying to maintain its presence.
That's a tricky situation. You've got all these other countries caught in the middle, too.
I remember reading about that whole South China Sea dispute. Seems like a textbook example of multipolarity in action.
Oh, absolutely. Basically, the South China Sea is this incredibly important waterway, strategically vital.
Lots of trade routes, I imagine.
Exactly. And China claims almost all of it as their own. The problem is...
Other countries have claims too, right?
Right. Several other countries in the region, including some U.S. allies like the Philippines, have their own claims. And this has created a ton of tension.
Because China's not backing down, are they?
Not at all. They've been building artificial islands, deploying military assets, really asserting their dominance in the area.
So how's the U.S. responding to that?
They're pushing back. The U.S. sees keeping the South China Sea open for navigation as, vital to their interests and to their allies' interests, too.
Freedom of navigation, that kind of thing.
Right. So they've been conducting naval exercises, sailing warships through those disputed waters. They're providing military support to countries like the Philippines, too.
But it's a delicate balance, isn't it?
Oh, incredibly delicate. Nobody wants things to escalate into a full-blown conflict.
It sounds like a high-stakes game of chicken, almost.
That's a good way to put it.
So what about those other countries in the region? Are they forced to choose sides?
That's the tough spot they're in. Like India, Japan, Australia. They've all got close economic ties to China.
But they rely on the U.S. for security.
Exactly. So they're trying to maintain good relationships with both sides, walking a tightrope.
That can't be easy.
No.
The report actually calls the Indo-Pacific complex and volatile, which feels like an understatement.
It's definitely a challenge. But the report does highlight some potential bright spots, too. Like there are these efforts to build regional dialogue, to find areas where they can cooperate, even with all the competition.
So some glimmers of hope.
Maybe. I think the key is for all the players to recognize that, ultimately, they do have a shared interest in stability, and to avoid actions that could make things worse.
Makes sense. So the Indo-Pacific is one flashpoint, but this report also talks about the Middle East, another region that's, well, used to conflict.
Right. The Middle East has been heavily influenced by the U.S. for decades.
The U.S. has been the main power broker there for a long time.
Exactly. The dominant military power, the mediator, the one everyone looked to for leadership. But that's changing. The report points to a few reasons for this.
Well, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, that was a big one.
Huge. It really signaled a shift. The U.S. is becoming more hesitant to get involved in those big, messy military interventions. The report also mentions the Iran nuclear deal, which has been shaky.
Right, and the conflicts in Syria, Yemen, all still going on.
Exactly. It all points to the old order breaking down.
So is the U.S. just abandoning the Middle East entirely?
Not entirely. The report suggests it's more of a shift in approach, less focus on those big military deployments.
Fewer boots on the ground.
Yeah, right. More emphasis on things like drone strikes, special forces raids, that sort of thing. They're also trying to get regional partners to take on more responsibility for their own security.
So less direct intervention, more reliance on technology and allies.
That's the trend. And part of this is driven by, needing to prioritize resources to compete with China.
Right, because it's all connected.
Exactly. It's like a giant game of global chess. You make a move in one region, it has ripple effects everywhere else.
That's a good analogy. And it's not just about military stuff, right? This whole multipolar thing, it's playing out in economics too.
Absolutely. It's not just about who has the biggest army anymore. It's about who controls the flow of trade, investment, technology.
And China's making some serious moves there.
Oh, yeah. Their Belt and Road Initiative, we talked about it earlier, it's a prime example. They're pouring billions, maybe even trillions, into infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, Europe.
Building ports, railways, all that.
And more. Roads, pipelines. The report argues this is a key part of their strategy to reshape the global economy.
To make it more favorable to them, obviously.
Oh, of course. They're not just building infrastructure, they're building relationships, securing access to resources.
Creating new markets for their products, too.
Exactly. It's a pretty savvy way to build influence.
Soft power, they call it.
Exactly. And the report highlights other trends, too. The growing importance of regional trade blocs, like the European Union. New financial centers popping up outside the West.
So economic power is becoming more diffused, too. Just like the political and military stuff.
Exactly. It's a pretty fundamental shift in how the world works.
And all of this is happening while we're facing these huge global challenges, right? Climate change, pandemics.
Absolutely. Cyber threats, resource scarcity, these are things no single country can solve on its own.
You'd think having more players on the world stage would make cooperation easier, though.
Right.
More brains, more resources.
You'd think so. But the report actually suggests that, at least in the short term, multipolarity might make cooperation harder.
Really? Why is that?
Well, it can lead to more competition, more mistrust, more difficulty in finding common ground, at least initially.
So are we headed for a more chaotic, conflict-ridden world? Is that inevitable?
The report doesn't give any easy answers. But it does say we need to find new ways to manage this multipolarity. We need new mechanisms for cooperation, for dialogue.
Even as competition gets tougher.
Right. We need to find ways to de-escalate tensions, build trust, focus on shared interests, even when we disagree on other things.
So diplomacy still matters, even in this more complex, competitive world.
Absolutely. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some strategies the report suggests for navigating this multipolar world and avoiding those pitfalls of division and conflict.
All right, so we've spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive really getting into the weeds of this multipolar world.
Yeah, lots to unpack.
It's kind of overwhelming, honestly, when you think about all these shifting power dynamics, all the potential for things to go wrong.
Definitely a lot.
But you've also said we're not just passive observers in all of this.
Right, we have choices to make. And those choices are going to shape the world we live in.
So no pressure or anything.
Right.
But seriously, where do we go from here? What does this report suggest we can actually do to, make sure this multipolar world doesn't turn into a complete disaster?
Well, the report doesn't sugarcoat things. It says straight up, competition between these major powers, it's probably going to get more intense.
Okay, not exactly reassuring.
But it also says this doesn't have to mean a new Cold War or, total chaos.
So what's the alternative? Give me some good news here.
The report talks about something they call strategic depolarization.
Strategic depolarization.
Catchy, but what does it actually mean?
Basically, it means finding ways to dial down the tension, moving away from this us versus them thinking that's everywhere these days.
Okay, sounds good in theory. But how do you actually depolarize a world that seems to be, actively polarizing itself?
It's tough, no question. But the report gives some concrete ideas. One big one is strengthening those multilateral institutions. You mean like the UN, the World Trade Organization, all that?
Yep, exactly. Those were set up after World War II to, encourage cooperation, provide a space for countries to talk to each other, work out their differences.
Right, to create some kind of global order?
Exactly. And they've had some successes, but they also face a lot of challenges in today's world.
Yeah, I can imagine. They were designed for a different time. When power was more concentrated, the world was less. Well, multipolar.
Right. So the question is, how can these institutions adapt? How can they be effective in a world where the players have such different interests, different values?
Good question. So what's the answer?
Well, one idea is to make these institutions more inclusive. Give more voice to those rising powers like China, India. Make sure the decision-making process reflects the way power actually IS in the world today.
So update the system, basically. Don't just cling to the old ways.
Right. And it's not just about the big global institutions either. Regional organizations, partnerships, those are important too.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Sure, think of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or the African Union. They can help promote dialogue, resolve disputes, build trust within their regions.
So it's like a multi-layered approach to global governance, recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. And along with strengthening these institutions, the report also talks about investing in diplomacy and conflict prevention.
Because it's always easier to stop a fight before it starts, right?
Exactly. So the report says we need to put more resources into those early warning systems, mediation efforts, all that, addressing potential conflicts before they blow up.
Which means having people on the ground, right? Diplomats, mediators, people who can actually talk to each other, build relationships.
Absolutely. Understanding those local nuances, working towards peaceful solutions.
It seems like this requires a real shift in mindset, though.
Yeah.
Not just for governments, but for all of us. Like, we need to stop seeing the world in terms of us versus them, winners and losers.
It's about recognizing that we all have a stake in peace and stability.
Easier said than done, maybe.
It is. But the report makes a really interesting point. It says this whole depolarization thing, it's not just the responsibility of governments.
Oh, who else are you supposed to do it?
Well, it takes a whole of society approach. Businesses, civil society, universities, even individuals, we all have a role to play.
So what can regular people do? I mean, it's easy to feel helpless when you're talking about these huge global issues.
Well, we can start by educating ourselves about the world, about different cultures, different perspectives. We can engage in dialogue with people from different backgrounds, respectfully, of course. Support organizations that are working to promote peace.
Okay, so be more informed, more engaged, more open-minded.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, reject that divisive rhetoric. Speak out against it. Instead, support policies that promote cooperation, that look for shared solutions.
It's like you said earlier, we have choices to make.
We do. And those choices matter.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's been, well, enlightening, to say the least. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the multipolar world. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious,